my partner Andy calls Student Square Ventures a conversation. And I like that because that captures it best in some ways. Just like we are having a conversation here, USV is this ongoing conversation about a series of topics. And the topics really are around kind of what technological forces are in the world and what societal forces are there. How are those coming together to reshape markets, and then what kind of investment opportunities does that create? And those are the topics that we talk a lot about. And obviously we all have a history of a portfolio and of past ways we've expressed our thesis that filter into this conversation. And so it's this kind of long, ongoing conversation around what does it mean to be investing at this moment in time.
And so when your understanding of time, is it the present, or is it 5 years from now or 10 years from now?
Well, I think you make an investment when you make it, so you have to invest in this moment in time. Obviously, it's all the jokes about you want to skate to where the puck's going to be, not where the puck is. So, we aren't interested in investing in things that people currently think are hot and hyped. We try to find things that are maybe a little off the beaten path, and that might grow into something. And one place where we have always tried to be very disciplined with regard to that is just valuation. If things just completely explode in valuation, we just it's not like we stop playing, but we try to find things that are a little more at the edge, a little more out there, and try to find earlier entry points. By the way, one of the things about venture investing is there's ways of making money in many different ways. And there are many momentum funds that have done very well. So I think that we like to invest the way we do, but it's far from the only successful model. And there are momentum players that have done incredibly well because some companies develop momentum and they keep it. And venture's a power law. And I mean, you just saw Wiz sell for $32 billion. And people who piled into that solely on the momentum did incredibly well. So I think that's really important. We invest this way because we like to invest this way, not because we think it's the only way to produce returns.
I don't see any other way than being able to do well unless you are enjoying what you're doing.
What happened was I was at MIT, I was getting my PhD, and I started my PhD in '93, and that's roughly the time that the web emerged. And by the time '96 rolled around, I'd done my general exam, and I was starting to work on my dissertation, and I had these moments where I'm like, what am I doing here? There's 3 people in the world who are ever going to read this. That's my 3 thesis advisors, and even that is slightly questionable, So in the meantime, this explosion of tech is happening, and so I wound up doing the worst of all possible things, which is I started a company and finished the dissertation and got married. And let's just say that's 3 things, and you should probably at most do 2 out of those 3.
But sometimes they also happen at the same time.
They did happen at the same time.
I shared earlier how I met my co-founder and wife, and I started the business, and it feels an interesting parallel. So in that sense, there was no strict time when you had to make a decision. And just thinking back to our community and over how it's such a binary process of choosing a career path, and we're almost moving to a stage whereby entrepreneurship is offered as a career path. Well, I don't think it's actually a career path, entrepreneurship.
Well, I actually think this is probably one of the big mistakes that we have made, is that we have created these strict segregations, especially in Europe, and to a degree here, but there's been more permeability here between academia and being a practitioner. And I think that I'm hoping that we're headed for a world where this permeability is even higher, where where somebody might do a company and then go back 3 years and work in a lab on a research project and then do another company, and like we want to increase this, and I think a lot of problems have come about because we have simply become too specialized, not just too specialized in a field, but too specialized in okay, within this field you're a practitioner, or within this field you're an academic, as opposed to sort of saying, well, you're working on this, and let's figure out how to create this exchange and this more flexible system. It's not, I'm not like trying to argue against tenure. I think it's good if some people have tenure because it's necessary for some things, but I think we have constructed the wrong incentive system in many, many areas. And if I look at academia, the sort of publish or perish incentive system and the high velocity publishing has been very detrimental to foundational progress in a lot of fields. So Gigi and I, we fund some research at Oxford, for example. There's very long-running, hard foundational research that may or may not produce any near-term papers. It may never get anywhere. For people like that today, it's virtually impossible to raise money because there's been this like, well, we're going to use publications as a benchmark and citations as a benchmark, and we're only going to fund research that gets, like, you wind up selecting for a type of academic and a type of person as an academic that I don't think is ultimately really conducive to moving science forward.
Why do you donate to foundational research? It's because you're looking for specific big answers to big questions?
Yes,
or?
Yes. So the context for the foundational research that we have helped fund is related to, so the particular project that we're funding at Oxford is called Constructor Theory, and it was originated by David Deutsch. A lot of the work is being led by a woman named Chiara Marletto. And it is about looking at the true deep foundations of physics, which is, do we formulate all of physics as states of the world and laws of motion? So both classical and quantum mechanics are, I either give you a classical state or a quantum state, and then I give you a law of motion or like a Schrödinger wave equation, and they work basically, from there on sort of deterministically in a way. The only thing that's sort of off to the side is statistical physics, which is kind of its own branch, which is actually in weird ways not fully connected to either one of the classical or quantum physics. And so it raises all sorts of problems, but it does relate directly to one of the fundamental philosophical problems, which is if you take the laws of physics as we know them today, then everything in the world is either predetermined or random, and that leaves no room for free will at all. No kind of logical free will construct. I mean, in that sense, the fact that we're having this conversation, that we're using these words, the specific equipment, all of this is either predetermined or random. But there was no human choice, actual choice, no concept of choice involved. And so that feels wrong. Now, of course, feels is not a scientific concept. Like, we also feel like we're stationary, but we know the globe is spinning and it's traveling around the sun, and the sun, all of that's traveling through the universe. So feels is not a scientific concept. But there is a problem here that I think is worth investigating, a foundational problem.
It's a huge question. And this can only be answered in academia. It can only be answered through private donations.
Well, whether it's private donations or government donations, it's the kind of thing that cannot be driven by the market.
Yeah.
So allocating attention, which is today, I believe, the fundamental allocation problem that humanity is facing. Allocating attention cannot, for the most part, happen through the price mechanism. Because there's no supply and demand for somebody to allocate attention to this question of, is there a different way of formulating the laws of physics? As Chiara would put it, as a science of can and can't, meaning just saying, here are transformations of physical reality that are possible, and here are transformations that are ruled out by the laws of physics. And trying to establish all of physics on the basis of things that can happen and things that can't happen. there's no price mechanism that would get enough allocation onto this problem. And this is the essence of what I'm trying to convey in my writing and in my book in particular, which is called The World After Capital, is that we have a lot of physical capital, right? So we can build machines and we can build buildings and railroads and cars. And I mean, look at, Tesla cranking out gigafactories, right? Tesla or SpaceX cranking out one spaceship after another, and blowing them up. But like, we build the next one and the next one. Like, we have the capital. It's much more a question of like, what are we pointing attention to? And obviously then capital follows that attention. And so for a lot of that stuff, we just can't use the price mechanism.
For a long while, for decades at least, I grew up in this mindset that, the only thing that mattered was consumerism. It's like letting the machine,
Sure.
And over the last decade, perhaps that philosophy kind of died, and we're in an empty space of why are we here?
We are in a transition phase, and transition phases are hard, which is why things feel very hard politically at the moment. So, and why are we in a transition phase? It's because digital technology in its totality has radically changed what's possible, what can be achieved, and how it can be achieved. This is in the here and now. And so if we look at the history of humanity, we've had, for all intents and purposes, 2 very large technology unlocks. David Deutsch likes to say 3 because the first one was fire and cooking meat. But let's leave that one aside. It was an important unlock. The ones I talk about in my book is the invention of agriculture, roughly 10,000 years ago. Right? And what happens is that all of a sudden the constraint shifts. So if you are a hunter-gatherer society, your constraint is food. Like, your tribe goes out and it either finds enough food or it doesn't. If it doesn't, you either starve or you migrate. It's like it's a very simple system. But when you invent agriculture, the constraint suddenly is like land, arable land. Can you grow enough stuff? And if you can have a flourishing agricultural society. If you can't, you run into trouble and you go to war or your society decays. But when you look at that change, like, agrarian societies are nothing like hunter-gatherer societies. I mean, we went from being nomadic to being sedentary. We went from very small and flat societies to, by comparison, very large, from at most a couple hundred people to thousands, tens of thousands of people, super hierarchical, like many, many, many layers of hierarchy, right? We went from being promiscuous to being monogamish. We went from animistic religions, so like every tree, every animal has a spirit in it, to theistic religions. I mean, these are just extraordinary, mind-blowing changes. All happened, over some time period, roughly 10,000 years ago, give or take. Right?
But they're huge shifts.
Huge, it's just crazy shifts.
Yeah.
Right?
Every few thousand years, there is a.
Well, it's not every few thousand. So that's the thing. So like that was 10,000 years ago. Then a couple hundred years ago, we invented industry. And the constraints shifted from arable land to capital, like who can build buildings and machines and factories and railroads, And when we made that shift, we went from living in the country to living in the city. We went from large extended family to nuclear family or no family. We went from the commons to basically everything being private property. And we went from kind of great chain of being theologies. So religion would be basically saying, look, I'm going to tell you how to be a good, you're a farmer. I'm going to tell you what you need to be a good farmer, but you'll never be a noble person because tough shit. You weren't born as a noble person, right? We went from that to Protestant work ethic, which was like, the harder you work, the better off you'll be. By the way, being rich is not a sin, we rewrote essentially what people consider to be God-given, right? And so that was only a couple hundred years ago. And now we have a technology that is so much more powerful than anything that came before. It's more foundational and more enabling than agriculture. It's more foundational and more enabling than traditional machines. I mean, all you need to do is take a look at the dozen humanoid robot startups, right? I mean, and then politicians look at that and go, yep, nothing to see here. Like, it's just a little reskilling program here, little tweak of the interest rate over there. It's like, it's insane.
Yeah.
It's completely insane. It's as profound as those prior transitions, which means that everything has to change, and it's not going to change incrementally. It has to change radically, drastically. And that's exciting and exhilarating. It's also scary as hell. Yeah. And the biggest problem is that most politicians have failed to understand that that's the magnitude of the problem, or they simply don't want to deal. Maybe they've understood it, but they don't want to deal. Yeah. And then they fail to come up with any kind of vision that is exciting for a lot of people, as opposed to being exciting for maybe a few elites. And then people are surprised by populism on the rise. Like, populism is filling this gap. People are scared.
Yeah, confused. Yeah.
They're confused, they're scared. There's a lack of leadership. So people come along and say, I have the answer. And the answer is, we're going to go back to the past. It's an easily understandable answer. Yeah. And it addresses people's fears. The thing you worried about, I'm going to make it go away by going back to some place that where you were okay.
Yeah. On the other hand, nobody's pointing towards a different world, right? So,
no, I mean, I think we're now seeing the green shoots of this. Like when you see, like, I've just bought it, I haven't read it yet, the Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson book Abundance. Like there's been the kind of American dynamism type thinking on the right. There's a documentary, Too Cheap to Meter. Like, how can we make electricity basically just this abundant, almost basically free thing, right? Like, the internet is too cheap to meter, right? I mean, you get a subscription and it's basically infinite, right? And can we make electricity be the same thing?
So it's understanding almost like infrastructural shifts that are happening that will allow for...
It's sort of deep forces, and forces that are likely to have a certain amount of permanence, So it's not short fashion style trend swings, but sort of deep forces. Why do we have a climate fund? Because it doesn't matter what DC says, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is rising, and we all understand the mechanics of warming that this induces, and that is a secular trend that isn't, has no sign of abating in the near term.
If you like, we had a government that was supportive of one sector, the climate side, but not very much on the crypto side, and now we have a government that is doing the opposite thing. The next government is going to... How emotional do you get about the politics of today compared to the general gist of the direction that this is?
Yeah, I mean, coming back to this idea that we're in this transition period, right? So when you're in a transition period that it requires disruptive, deep, transformational change as opposed to incremental change, that's a really big challenge for political systems. Political systems are designed to provide stability. And that's generally speaking a good thing, right? I mean, so now when I look at what's happening is, I think that focusing on specific policies is not where I'm concerned, right? So we didn't build a climate portfolio that's like entirely dependent on the IRA, for example. In fact, I thought the IRA was terrible, and when I was asked to endorse it, I refused because it was this big pork-laden bill, and it was setting fixed prices for technology that was on a learning curve. It was just mostly wrong in my mind. And conversely, I think, crypto is this foundational technology that will make progress, barring the sort of complete and outright ban of any and all crypto, which would be very hard to enforce because it would require banning computers, basically, or broad access to computers. So we do spend time on regulations, not that we don't think about it, but we try not to construct a portfolio that's entirely dependent on regulation going this way or going that way, because we don't control it, and that would be bad. The concern with where we're moving politically, though, is more one around, there is an increasing sense that people are like, yeah, we do need dramatic change. And then people are like, oh, and democracy is not getting it done, so let me go back a strong man, Let me just back somebody who is intentionally going to dismantle democratic breaks because I just feel that's the only way something's going to get done. You know, something important is going to get done, and that I think is a very dangerous route. I mean, that is also, in essence, you know, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, we had these fledgling early democratic shoots, and many of them got snuffed out in that moment because they couldn't kind of get the switch over from the agrarian age to the industrial age done. And so in many ways, it got done by dictators and through wars.
Yeah.
And so that is, I think,
because if you like, Germany at the beginning of last century was in a very different position than...
Yeah, and so that is, I think, the worrisome element of this political moment is that there's once again the sense that democracies are moribund and that the problems are so big that democracies can't deal with them, and so screw it, let's just go with the dictator model.
And so it requires discipline and patience of bringing marginal improvements to the existing system.
No, I think what it requires is having a somewhat broader view of what democracy is. So I don't think we're going to get to the changes that we need by going to the voting booth every 2 or 4 years. So
it's incredible. If you were a CEO, imagine you're given 4 years to manage a company of 300 million customers, and it's
300 million employees.
It's 300 million employees. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's incredible how challenging that job is, regardless of what you want to achieve. Right?
Yeah.
So I interrupted you.
No, not at all. Not at all. But so I believe we need to go back to ideas around constitutional assemblies, citizens' assemblies, you know, even if they're not constitutional, but maybe they're around specific issues, as models of being able to make more dramatic change without having to go through elections and the traditional legislative cycles. A good example of this is, you know, Ireland had this very long impasse around abortion, and then they did a citizens' assembly, and now they have a working abortion law. Like an issue that was so politically fraught, and the ideas were so different between the parties, and they're like, let's go back to literally putting citizens in charge of this process, and they did it, and that worked. And so I think as long as our view of what democracy is kind of narrow around the way it has narrowed down, I think we will be in trouble with the democratic model.
We're pushing into this theme of perhaps a second session, Albert, because this is super interesting and very valuable personally, but I also imagine for the majority of founders, especially those that are trying to, rather than commercializing IP or science, they're trying to solve big challenges through science. So I think of, you know, the kind of work that we're doing, for example, in fertility, that has some huge ethical, regulatory, you know, anthropological considerations to be made today for where society will be based on the data, but also how the general feeling of politics is at. And we're trying hard to figure that piece out as venture builders. That's where I spend the majority of my time before investing, is really identifying what are the problems that we want to solve, and then figuring out the messaging and the angle of that, even to present it to, you know, our investment committee at a time when we may be out of phase with the overall narrative, right? So it's I sense there are very few leaders in venture capital that think like you.
My view is that as an investor and as an entrepreneur, you massively benefit from having principles, principles of thought and principles of values and principles of philosophy that you're not going to cross, even if that would let you make a quick buck. That is not at all to say that unethical people can't succeed. It happens all the time. It's just, what does it do to the person as well, right? And so I believe, to me, this is going back to the sort of ancient Greek philosophical ideas of leading the good life. The good life is you're not only working on a hard problem, but you have some principles that you're not going to cross. I believe that in many areas of sort of bioethics and so forth, we've become way too risk averse, and we've become way too like, can't do this, can't do that, can't do a self-experiment, can't do like, challenge trials and all these things. I think that's very bad, and it's been bad for progress, bad for the rate of progress, etc. When I talk about principles, it's more things like, what do I fundamentally believe? For instance, humans owe each other, and why, and where does that come from? Rather than the sort of more like, what's the current vogue of are challenge trials allowed, yes or no? It's just like, what is it about challenge trials that under certain circumstances makes them problematic? And having some first principles that let you think about it, rather than sort of the current fashion is they're in or they're out. I think that's what has made us good investors at USV, is that we try to come at this from a first principles perspective, not from scooters are currently vogue, so we should have a scooter deal.
Yeah, I remember that time. I could continue for a while, Albert, but I know that we are over time, and I'd rather keep the good.
For a to be continued. Session. Yes, that was fun.
Is that right? Hey, thank you for your time today.
You bet.